And now, CCW News presents Holy Crap! This is actually happening! Big News Edition, July 10, 2022. I'm Chuck U. Farley. The big news this week is the tragic assassination of beloved former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. After he was shot in public by a homemade gun, King Brandon, per script, had to immediately politicize the tragedy by comparing the U.S. with a tiny island nation with a near entirely homogeneous population known for being at the top of the list of the strictest gun control laws on the planet. With apologies for our slimy, disingenuous, opportunist dictator, we here at CCW News send our deepest condolences to the people of the great nation of Japan. On the topic of oppressive gun control, the big news ignored this week was the United Parcel Service's non-announcement that it is going to help Dear Leader with his promise to get rid of the Second Amendment without actually getting rid of the Second Amendment. They covertly sent letters to guns parts dealers stating that all accounts are immediately canceled and any packages currently in the UPS system will be seized and destroyed regardless of contents. UPS is using the excuse that these perfectly legal parts, all of which are serial stamped and approved by the ATF, somehow allow the buyer to create ghost guns, since the Brandon regime and most of their cult members have no clue what a ghost gun is. Speaking of big guns, the big news this week is that Elon Musk effectively ended Twitter by backing out of his $44 billion purchase of the company because they could not, or would not, prove that more than half of their users are actually bots. The extremely socialist media company has been on high alert since Musk first offered to buy it and turn it into a free speech platform, with many employees needing mental health treatment for the very thought that someone might be allowed to disagree with them publicly. Most did everything they could to ensure Musk could not buy the company, and now that he has backed out, they are suing him because he announced he isn't buying it, which caused the stock price to tumble off a cliff. Of course, being far-left socialists, they fail to see the irony. Speaking of demolishing evil things, the big news this week is that the Georgia Guidestones, a monument to totalitarianism and genocide, have finally been bombed out of existence. One can only hope the globalist plan they espoused will follow. Even though the authorities and press have sworn for decades that the mysterious tablets were simply an art installation on private property which became a mecca for Satanists, both are calling the early morning explosion domestic terrorism, so as not to confuse the act with the dozens of real, taxpayer-funded monuments that were destroyed during the fiery but mostly peaceful riots of yesteryear. Continuing with the subject of widespread protests, the big news this week is the actual insurrection in Sri Lanka. More than 100,000 protesters seeking relief from their leader's lack of response to a collapsing economy, which has left most citizens unable to afford food, medicine, or fuel, invaded the homes of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, as well as the Prime Minister and several other governmental ministers, all of whom lived in mansions and weren't affected by their own terrible policies. The President, Prime Minister, and 5 other ministers resigned early Sunday, which led to protesters singing in the streets and taking over the presidential palace. The U.S. press is largely reporting on the uprising as heroic, completely failing to see the irony. Similar protests against repressive, tyrannical globalists took place simultaneously in Albania and several other democratic socialist nations and are most likely coming to a town near you. Sliding easily into the topic of election meddling, the big news for several months has been the Democrat Party's funding of Republican candidates in the midterms by running several ads across several states for what they hope is the most radical, far-right candidate in hopes of getting a final candidate that even Democrats can win against. Democrats are so desperate that they're trying to find funding anywhere they can. For instance, after Project Veritas released uncut audio of South Carolina Democratic candidate Crystal Matthews' phone call to a prisoner whom she asked for drug money and straw donors to finance her campaign, then demanded black bloc brigades to go out at night to steal property from constituents, the Mockingbird media immediately began reporting that the uncut audio was carefully edited, without showing where or how uncut recordings can be so carefully edited. Matthews elaborated that Democrats are so racist, the only way black people will get more representation in government is to run so-called sleepers who are willing to pretend they are Republicans because Republicans don't care what race their candidates are. As a die-hard liberal, she of course failed to see the irony. Still on the topic of duplicitous politicians, The big news this week is that party boy and dollar store Trump impersonator Boris Johnson resigned because his nation was going to fire him for governing like a globalist instead of like Trump. Following in the footsteps of his dictator bestie Kevin Trudeau and trained up by Bond villain Klaus Schwab, the big news this week is that Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte has throttled production in the name of globalism that aims to put most farmers out of business. This is a questionable move during a national food shortage crisis, particularly as he's doing it in the name of emissions regulations, even as the nation returns to using coal as their main power source since all the green nonsense did not work. Rutte, of course, fails to see the irony. Speaking of blackface Trudeau fanboys, the big news this week is that professional hypocrite Gavin Newsom, governor of California and U-Haul Salesman of the Year, took time off from filming hit pieces to run in Florida on the taxpayer's dime to make a grand virtue signal banning all travel and trade to 23 states that he felt weren't gay enough. The list included Montana, where it was just revealed that he and his family are vacationing for an indeterminate amount of time. Just like his multiple lavish maskless parties during the height of the COVID pandemic, this elite gets away with rules for thee, but not for he. King Brandon has had a banner week too. The biggest news this week is that Dear Leader learned closing down pipelines and ending all domestic drilling results in ridiculous gas prices, which are literally killing trade and will soon starve millions of citizens. With America leading, if not creating, a global recession, Creepy Joe pretends to care by trying to read statements his handlers put on teleprompter, promising bandage measures like releasing our emergency oil reserves so we might save 7 cents on ramen noodles for a week, even though we can't afford the drive to work, much less the grocery store. Thanks to his continued mishandling of literally everything, our emergency reserve is at its lowest level since 1986, while consumer gas prices are the highest in all history. But wait, there's more. Brain freeze Biden then went on to export 5 million barrels of our emergency reserve oil overseas, making sure that his biggest supporter and number one global polluter, China, got at least 1 million of those barrels. In fact, by total coincidence, the private company that got the most barrels in China is 10% owned by his son, Hunter Biden. Bumbling Joe then fumbled his way through a Medal of Honor ceremony during which he mispronounced literally every recipient's name and for some reason gave the highest civilian honor to a lesbian soccer player who makes her living trampling on the American flag while whining that she's not paid enough, and Denzel Washington for reasons no one can ascertain. He then awarded Steve Jobs and John McCain the award, as he said, posthumously, because it isn't funny anymore. Finally, the child sniffer-in-chief used the 10th Amendment as toilet paper when he announced that he's using an executive order to make infanticide federal law because, as he said, only a dictator would rule by executive order. He finished his thoroughly rehearsed speech by reading, end of quote, repeat the line. For CCW News, this has been holy crap. This is actually happening. I'm Chuck U. Farley. Good night, and may God help us.